Hello, friends. Welcome to the Peace and Power Ukraine podcast, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history where East meets West and freedom collides with totalitarianism. Thank you for joining us during these unprecedented times for peace negotiations, challenging really the United States, Ukraine, Russia, the entire world. So, as always, I hope to bring you more light than heat as we dig deeper with public policy experts from across the spectrum. For today's podcast, I'm joined by Julian Hayda. Julian is the Associate Director of Public Engagement at Razom for Ukraine, the largest pro-Ukraine nonprofit in the United States. Previously, he worked as a radio journalist in Ukraine and the U.S. and was a Ukrainian Catholic seminarian in Kyiv. He was born and raised in Chicago, where he now lives with his wife, Summer, and a baby daughter, Theophania. So congratulations on that, and welcome, Julian.
Thanks so much, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate so much you joining me today. I first met you on one of the trips I made to Kyiv, and we got to travel together and attend some events together that you were representing Razom. So tell me, what's Razom up to right now? What's the big focus of your work?
Sure. Well, I work on the advocacy team at Razom, but we are actually a much bigger organization. The name Razom means together in Ukrainian. And that's really what we do. We're the glue that brings together different civil society organizations in the United States and in Ukraine to work toward a free, democratic, and prosperous Ukraine according to the principles of the Euromaidan revolution, which occurred about 10 years ago. That's when our organization was founded. And our idea is to make sure that those sacrifices that people made now 11 years ago on the Maidan Square in Kyiv, and the sacrifices that the brave men and women in uniform that are fighting for Ukraine are not for naught, and that the democratic future that they want for Ukraine, the exciting future that they want for their children, happens, and that the U.S. can be there and support them along the way for that. So 90% of what we do is humanitarian. We help run hospitals, mental health clinics. We have multiple warehouses across Ukraine. We have frontline drivers delivering aid. We have surgeons coming in and out of the country under the Razom umbrella. Most of what we do is humanitarian, but I work on the advocacy side, making sure that our lawmakers and our leaders across the United States get the right information on Ukraine and make sure that they continue to support Ukraine and understand that our values are very much aligned.
Good. Now, for those that are watching us today, I've got the White House behind me. Now, as part of your advocacy work, I assume you're trying to get the attention and message to the White House amongst many others. Is that accurate for the work that Razom's up to?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we work on Ukraine policy, any sort of policy that touches on Ukraine. We believe that it is in the fundamental American interest for Ukraine to be free and prosperous. It is the crossroads of the world. Ukraine means on the borderlands. It is in a very strategic and important place for the world, and especially for the United States. And we understand that currently the biggest policy affecting Ukraine is the Trump administration's bilateral relationship with both Ukraine and with Russia. And so we are trying to make sure that any sort of conversation that the administration has with either Ukraine or Russia is as productive as possible and is in the interests of the shared values that we as Americans and Ukrainians hold, the values of democracy, of a free press, of free religion, of free expression, all the things that brave Ukrainian men and women are putting down their lives for, and that brave American men and women have previously put their lives down for here in the States as well.
Yeah, that I want to ask about those headlines this last weekend. But first, you made a point about where Ukraine sits. It's called borderlands, but it's on the border of everything. If you look at a world map, most of them have the Middle East in the middle. But just above the Middle East, at a crossroads of so many trade routes in human history, is Ukraine. And it's just a pivotal crossroads as the Middle East. And once I came to understand that, that really changed my mindset as an American. Would you agree agree that that's a fair way to lay that out?
I mean, the Middle East and kind of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf are very important for sea routes and have for thousands of years been important for ocean-going kind of cultures, the Romans or the Byzantines, and the rising kind of Islamic kind of caliphates to use those trade routes. But countries more Northern European that have wanted to reach Asia have had to go overland, and that has been particularly through Ukraine. Ukraine is also incredibly wealthy in terms of resources. The agriculture in Ukraine is unparalleled in almost the entire world, except for maybe parts of Iowa or Nebraska. And now, of course, we're learning about so much of Ukraine's mineral wealth. Not even to mention the incredible resources of transportation with the Black Sea there, the Dnipro River that goes all the way up north. There's so much there that Ukrainians have had to defend for centuries and have been exploited by so many different sides because it is so strategically placed.
Right. So we now understand geographically then why this is such a big deal for the conflict between Ruski Mir, the Russian world ideology, which dominates Putin's mindset, and a westward-looking Ukraine. That is such a threat to him that it must be stopped. It was worth going to war over to stop Ukraine from being westward-oriented, to being having the rule of law, having freedom of religion, having all of these things that we take for granted as basic principles in the West.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a deep identity crisis in Russia, and there has been since the days of Boris Godunov and Peter the Great. The Russians are always asking, who are we? Who are we? You know, the language of the Russian imperial court was French for the longest time. Half the Romanovs are actually ethnically German. They're trying to kind of like figure out who they are. And the Ukrainians who've worked the land, kind of had everything they've ever needed to live, not much more, not much less, have kind of stood in the way of that and been very confident in who they are and what they represent and what they want and what they need. And it's very much also conflict on identity. You know, Vladimir Putin has said, like many of kind of Russian leaders past, that Ukraine is a fundamental part of Russia, although Ukrainians do not believe that Russia is a part of Ukraine. So they can't live without Ukraine. We can live without Russia. And in fact, when Ukrainians want to live without Russia, the Russians wield their heads, like I mentioned, the revolution 11 years ago. When Ukraine decided to have good relationships with both Russia and Europe, Russia said, no, it's a zero-sum game. You have to choose us.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of our American audience who's joined today, that's important background to understand. This isn't just an issue for the last 3 years, and it's not just an issue since 2014. It goes deeper than that, but 2014 was a pivotal moment in history. Now, to the headlines, we might have witnessed a pivotal moment in human history during this last weekend. At the time of this recording, we just saw Trump and Zelensky have a meeting in the Vatican. It was a knee-to-knee meeting as they sat there with the huge pillars of the Vatican surrounding them like witnesses. And there was no J.D. Vance in the middle. There were no translators. It was just the two of them. It was a powerful image, which we could look back on and say that was a moment of decision where an eventual peace that we all pray and hope to see, maybe that was a moment. Are you optimistic that was that kind of moment?
I mean, I have to be an optimist. I don't know of any Ukrainian who does not want peace. Every Ukrainian wants peace. And I think what not only recent days events and the meeting, the kind of the very personal knee-to-knee meeting, as you said, between Presidents Trump and Zelensky demonstrates, is that Ukrainians have been working towards peace while defending themselves. They have not been belligerents in this war. They have been defending themselves. And even though there is this charade of a ceasefire that President Putin is now proposing, we know that Russia has violated every ceasefire, has violated every peace agreement for the last several decades, not only with regards to Ukraine, but also with regards to Georgia. And so it's very important to kind of for Ukraine to kind of continue to demonstrate that it is committed to peace. And I think President Trump, with his messages on social media, is starting to realize that it is not Ukraine that is standing in the way of peace, that it is Russia, that Russia will continue to attack even though they say that they want peace, because they don't want peace, they want Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's right. President Trump may have begun to pivot towards a position of it's time for sticks and steel against Putin, who hasn't been moving. Now, in reaction, Putin has offered one of these famous ceasefires. Okay, I'm gonna have a 3-day ceasefire this time, starting May 8th. I think is the proposal, and it's to honor the victory of the Russians in World War II. So supposedly a 72-hour peace ceasefire. I'm pessimistic on this topic. Do you join me in that pessimism? Is this just a PR move by Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's playing a tricky propaganda kind of game with this. You said something kind of very interesting a second ago, and I think a lot of people kind of and Putin kind of plays into that is they talk about the Russian victory over fascism. This has been part of the Russian narrative of their role in history for the last century, is that Russia defeated fascism, and they justify their war against Ukraine right now as a war against fascism. Of course, that's absurd for two reasons. Because not only was World War II won not by Russia, not even by the Soviet Union, which has many constituent nations, but by the Allies, by our brave Americans, by the British, by everybody who was involved in this effort.
The French, the Polish, there
were so many of us. And it's, of course, deeply disrespectful to the actual Soviet citizens who died during World War II, because disproportionately those were Ukrainians on the front lines. Yes. World War II was fought over in terms of the front, the Eastern Front, went all the way across Ukraine and all the way back over Ukraine. So the human cost of World War II on the Eastern Front was really borne by the people of Ukraine. But this has been turned into the Russian victory over fascism and kind of this narrative that Russia is continuing to fight against the same evil, which is kind of Western or German in nature. And that I think is really disingenuous and really kind of intellectually dishonest and is really dangerous in many respects. Another reason why these kinds of ceasefires raise red flags in Ukraine is because every time, like I mentioned before, every time there's a ceasefire, not only does Russia violate the ceasefire, but it's an opportunity for Russia to regroup. It's an opportunity for Russia to wage other forms of maybe not kinetic warfare, but cyber warfare, intelligence warfare, etc. It's an opportunity for them to bring out their propaganda, as is this kind of rehistoricizing their role in the defeat of fascism. So we're seeing that play out. They might stop shooting for a few days, but they're already kind of using these mind games to make it seem like they're on the right side of history, which we know better than anybody as Americans in the Cold War and as Ukrainians who were caught up in kind of at the worst end of World War II on both sides, that's just simply not true. And Ukrainians are defending the kind of the basic human dignity that I think every American knows is worth standing up for.
Right. Wow. Powerful points there. Let's hit another headline, the minerals deal. You mentioned a little bit ago, Ukraine is very much the breadbasket of Europe. People have understood that. But also now we understand how rich in minerals and resources that it can be as well. We still hear that this is going to get done. Everyone's optimistic. Are you optimistic on this issue or pessimistic? We kind of go back and forth here.
Well, I think you had a previous guest on your show, Peter Pomerantsev, who underlined the point that this was Ukraine's initiative. Is if we are to really understand American geopolitics through an America First lens, which is completely understandable, then we have to understand that, or the people in Ukraine and the Zelensky administration especially understands that the arguments cannot be ones of values like I've been making so far. The arguments also have to be in the sheer economic interest of the United States. And the fact is, with a rising China, a Ukraine-US relationship, especially with regards to the minerals that we all depend on in our cell phones and in our cars, whether they may not be electric cars or not electric cars, all of our devices depend on the kinds of resources that Ukraine has. And Ukrainians don't want to take a turn towards China. Ukrainians want to take a turn towards the United States. So it is our responsibility now as Americans to take them, to build a positive and fruitful and mutually beneficial relationship there. Because in the free market of the world that we live in today, Ukraine will take those resources elsewhere. And that would be very bad for both the strategic interests and the security interests of the United States and economic interests of the United States.
Yeah, that's right. I would hate to see Ukraine being forced to build a minerals relationship with China or eastward instead of with us. If we miss this opportunity, it's important for United States interests, national interests as well. Long term, there's all this talk about, Apple moving all of their product building out of China, maybe into India. But the raw elements, those come from someplace. So wouldn't we want to see that Ukraine has westward investment relationships, partnerships with the United States, Europe, and, India, not China. Those are the kinds of things that in the long term, when we begin to see a world that has an armistice or some cessation of hostilities, that's what Ukraine needs to build in this next step for the rebuilding phase.
It also demonstrates, look, during that really awful Oval Office meeting back in February, President Trump kept telling President Zelensky, you don't have the cards. And it not only did President Zelensky say we're not playing cards or we're talking about the lives of people, but Ukraine does have very, very much in terms of negotiating power here, and has a very strong negotiating position. And the minerals are part of that. Many of the minerals are in deposits under Russian occupation, and we know what happens when the United States needs things and has strong alliances that conflicts get resolved, and it's mutually beneficial.
So I feel like we have a theme going on in this relationship. We talked about Crossroads, Ukraine being at the crossroads of Europe. We have this moment where Zelensky and Trump in the Vatican, they might be at crossroads for their relationship. Could we also see that Trump and Putin are at a crossroads of their relationship?
I think it's very important to, when looking at the US-Russia relationship or the Ukraine-Russia relationship, to separate out words from actions. And after 100 days of words from the Trump administration and very, very, very many actions from the Trump administration, we're not seeing really any actions on the side of Russia. And I can sense and I can tell through President Trump's public appearances and comments on this that he's growing very, very frustrated. That he thought this would be a very easy thing to resolve, and I admire that. But we also kind of we're seeing that Putin has been at this for 25 years, and he believes the stakes are centuries deep. That this is not a simple land grab. This is a matter of his own identity, of his own country's identity. And so it's not something that could be resolved in 100 days or in 24 hours. This is something that he feels like he'll only win when he wins all of Ukraine. And it is up to the rest of us who want to see a world where borders matter, where borders are secure, no matter where those borders may be, to kind of make sure that people can't just completely ignore the laws and,
Yes.
and the borders that are in place.
Right. Julian, I'm sitting here in Washington on the week of the 100-day anniversary of the Trump administration. So I feel like this is a bit of a crossroads, and Trump's mind and many in this town are seeing that we are at the end of the beginning. And there were a lot of high hopes in the foreign policy arena and some successes, but no definitive major successes like bringing a serious ceasefire, something that Zelensky pushed for us. It's got to be at least 30 days to see that this is real. This is something that we can hold the Russians to. Ceasefires do not happen accidentally. They take time to prepare for. There have to be all sorts of minutia agreed to. When there's a ceasefire, does that mean drones can or cannot fly over? Obviously, we're saying they're not firing, but can they fly over the enemy? Or if they're flying over the enemy, does the enemy have the right to shoot back? What constitutes a ceasefire has to be agreed to down to every single inch, type of weapon, type of tool, so that it is something real that then can be the foundation of a continuing peace. And that's why it can't just be a sporadic, we'll have an Easter ceasefire that nobody knows is coming announced. We'll have a 3-day ceasefire. At least in this case, we might have a week to prepare. It's got to be something that's planned for and executed in a diplomatic way with a real foundation to it.
Well, let's not forget that President Putin was a KGB intelligence officer. He's very good at playing word games, at gaslighting all of us. And so when, we saw during the last attempt at a ceasefire, that things were casually lost in translation. Was it, a cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure, or energy and infrastructure, or infrastructure that transports energy, or only transportation infrastructure? It was so deliberately vague on the Russian side that they could claim anything is a violation on the Ukrainian side, and therefore they could strike back, and they're acting in their own kind of defensive interests, which again is absurd because the war is being fought in Ukraine for Ukrainian territory. I think it just demonstrates that there's so little good faith on the Russian side, and there is perhaps even too much good faith on the Ukrainian side. But to the Ukrainians' credit, they want to save lives, like President Trump wants to save lives. We just cannot give up. As Americans, we cannot give up on them, because that should be the primary goal here, is saving lives. And if that means it's in the best American interest, which it is, that's good too.
Yeah, that should be the real tell for any American to understand. Are the Ukrainians westward in their orientation? Are they like us? It's that they value life. They love life. They want to save lives. The Russians, as part of this axis of evil, much like the same thinking that happens with Hamas or the Iranians or the North Koreans, there is no value to life. Life is simply a tool, and that's shown in their tactics, these meat grinder assaults and tactics that they use, and the attacking of civilians. That is the mindset. And it really goes back to, I think, a people that are in Ukraine that are very faith driven. Now, I understand you had a background as a seminarian in Kyiv. Tell us about that part of your journey. And is that accurate to describe the Ukrainian people really as a very faithful and very religious people?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a reason they call it the Bible Belt of Europe. It has some of the highest church-going populations in Europe, akin to Italy. These are people who are deeply connected to their families, deeply connected to their labor, to their toils. Everybody has a little piece of land. They're all fiercely independent. They all want to be able to know where their food is coming from, know where their taxes are going to. They all want to make sure that the government is not going to take away either their government or another government and take away their children or separate their families. They want to make sure that people are born and die with dignity. And it just so happens that our system of kind of democracy that we have in the U.S., I like to say that it's not that the Ukrainians are pro-Western, it's that they're pro-life. And it just so happens that the system that we have here in the West, in the United States, is the one that's best suited to the values that Ukrainians already have. My own background, I come from a 400-year lineage of priests, of Ukrainian Catholic priests. In the Ukrainian Catholic Church, priests can be married. And so that family unit of being deeply invested in the local community, in the village, as a family, working together, praying together, sharing resources in a way that raises up your local community is something that deeply resonates with me and deeply resonates with my faith's tradition and understanding of the gospel. And I think that is why Ukraine has proven to be so resilient and so committed to these principles that we as Americans recognize in our own country and society.
Good. Well, let me follow up with a question about what we're seeing unfold in Rome. The conclave, I guess, is going to begin May 7th. We have a history with this past pope of, as I understand it, relatively supportive of Ukraine. Maybe you can correct me and describe his position. But then what do we anticipate? Are we hopeful that for Ukraine's purposes, this could be a successful transition to a new pope?
That's a very
There's
good
a lot
question.
wrapped up there.
Yeah, I mean, look, Pope Francis does have did have a very deep and long-standing relationship with Ukraine and the Ukrainian church. As a young seminarian, when he was just a teenager in Buenos Aires, his rector and his confessor were a Ukrainian Catholic priest, a refugee. Much like Pope Francis's own family from Italy, these were refugees from Ukraine to Argentina. And so he prayed with Ukrainians. Every morning he did a Ukrainian in the language of Church Slavonic, the Ukrainian kind of religious kind of language, sacred language. Prayed Eastern Christian, Ukrainian kind of divine services in Argentina. The head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, it's a worldwide community of 6 million faithful. Before he was the bishop of Kyiv, the kind of the patriarch of Kyiv, as we call him, he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And so he would go over to Cardinal Bergoglio's home and vice versa all the time. They'd pray with each other. They had relationships. They raised money even for the needs of the Ukrainian community, which tends to be very poor in Argentina. So Pope Francis knew our Ukrainian tradition and our Ukrainian communities very, very well. But of course, I think, as any parent, we call him the Holy Father. As with any parent, you try to love all your children. And sometimes those children can be really bad. And sometimes they can wage war against the other children. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think, his own kind of pastoral love towards the Russian people, which is understandable from a Christian perspective, many people in Ukraine felt a bit like not the prodigal son, but the other son, and felt betrayed that the Ukrainians have done the work, that they have stayed true to their principles. And so why is Pope Francis extending an olive branch yet again to the Russians, yet again repeating, or at least appearing to give credence to the Russian position? And that was very hurtful to very many Ukrainians. That said, Pope Francis did privately and publicly support Ukraine very much. He was on the phone with people in Ukraine constantly. He personally donated to Ukrainian causes. He facilitated the release of Ukrainian Catholic priests that Gary, you and we met in Kyiv last year, who spent a year and a half in Russian captivity. Pope Francis offered to broker a peace between Ukraine and Russia and be a mediator, which the Russian side did not take up. The Russian side didn't feel like they'd be a fair mediator. So I think he was trying to present himself as an arbiter in the conflict in a way that didn't necessarily pan out, but I think was very, very admirable. And I think that is one of the roles that the Vatican has taken on in other conflicts, and perhaps the next pope will be that person as well. I will add there is one cardinal elector, the youngest cardinal elector, who is a Ukrainian Catholic bishop who's currently stationed in Australia, Mykola Bichuk, and he is the only Ukrainian Catholic cardinal. He was only selected last fall, and he's probably not a favorite. There's never been an Eastern Catholic as opposed to a Latin Roman Catholic Pope. But it's very interesting that there will be at least one Ukrainian voice in the conclave bringing up these issues, these moral and ethical and social issues that deeply resonate with the gospel and the kind of Catholic social teaching while at the conclave.
I am so glad I asked you this, Julian Hayda. That was a very insightful answer. You had a lot to share with us. That was powerful. Two questions. For those that aren't watching on camera, you have a traditional Ukrainian shirt on. Tell us about that. And then tell us about when you were studying in Kyiv, what language were you being taught in?
Ooh, very good question. So yes, I'm wearing what's called a vyshyvanka. This is a traditional Ukrainian cross stitch. And I will never forget some stories of my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother, she died in 2004. She was born in 1902, lived through 2 world wars, and shared and told me these stories as I was a child of what it was like to live through these 2 world wars. She said during much of her youth, she would have been thrown in prison for wearing a shirt like this. It is a form, one of the very many forms of resistance. One of the ways that the Ukrainian people have only just lived. This is only just how you sew together clothes. It is essentially a peasant shirt that has colored threads to it to make it a little bit more pretty and festive. But as with any kind of group that has been subject of kind of imperial annihilation or conquest, you choose those symbols and you try to eradicate them. So the Ukrainian language was eradicated in the Russian Empire under 2 imperial orders, where the publication of the Ukrainian language was banned, under the Ems order and the Voluyev circular. You could look these things up on Wikipedia. They banned the Ukrainian language. And during various parts of Ukrainian history, this basic peasant shirt that someone would have worn either if it be for a holiday or while kind of reaping wheat in the field, would have been banned as well. They would have had to wear other forms of clothing because it was too associated with their identities. So we like to kind of wear this clothing again, kind of as a kind of a reminder of where we come from and as a form of resistance. Yet again, people under Russian occupied territories are being persecuted for their use of the Ukrainian language. They're being targeted for their use of the Ukrainian language, and they're being targeted for wearing clothing like this. And so this is my way of standing in solidarity with them. It's also just beautiful. I mean, I think anytime we destroy anything that's beautiful, we do a disservice to all of humanity. To answer your question about the seminary in Kyiv, my seminary education was in Ukrainian. So I really had to kind of improve my Ukrainian. I grew up speaking Ukrainian, even though I'm an American here in the U.S. But I had to learn, Platonic philosophy. I had to learn medieval scholasticism in Ukrainian, which is very, very interesting and very challenging. A lot of the texts, because Ukraine has only recently been able to, in the last 30 years, publicly celebrate their freedom of religion and freedom of press. Many of the texts, especially older historical texts, are still in Russian. And so the Ukrainians are still working to publish texts in Ukrainian and translate them from Latin or German or Church Slavonic. So some of the texts are in Russian, which I can't read, but some of my classmates could read. And so that's a challenge that we're still working on, kind of reestablishing centuries of destruction and kind of giving Ukrainians that credence. A lot of the books also were published in Canada and in the United States. So we're very grateful to Canada and the United States. Half of our library was published in the U.S. Because in the U.S., you're able to publish books in Ukrainian. In Russia, you're not.
Now, if my history is fuzzy, correct me, but I recall that one of the Soviet premiers, Nikita Khrushchev, was Ukrainian. So was the language allowed then? When did it come back into legally you're allowed to use Ukrainian?
So Nikita Khrushchev notably did not speak Ukrainian. I mean, he may have privately, but he never spoke it publicly. There was a very kind of really truncate a few hundred years of history. The Russian Empire, which spans from the Pacific Ocean all the way deep into Europe, they try to standardize and forcibly assimilate everybody into speaking Russian. And again, if you remember from earlier, the irony being that even the emperor didn't speak Russian. The emperor spoke either German or French. But they tried to assimilate everybody into one culture and force them to adopt one culture. So that included the Ukrainians. When the Soviet Union replaced the Russian Empire, Vladimir Lenin had a very clever idea, which was to say, we will use all of these captive nations, all of these groups that have been colonized by the Russians, we'll give them their identities back so that they fight against the Tsar, so they fight against the empire. And so there was a moment where the Ukrainian language was legalized, but in a very opportunistic way by the communists. Mm-hmm. That only lasted a few years. Stalin, who himself was Georgian, not Russian, but Russian speaker, Stalin said, hey, this is a mistake, because once you have all these different countries speaking different languages, what would unify them for this great communist project, this great communist Soviet Union, and this ideal? And so Stalin reversed that policy and went back to the old imperial policy. Mm-hmm. Everybody had to speak Russian. Everything had to be published in Russian. All culture has to be Russian. When Stalin died, they tried to strike some compromises, but of course the damage had been done. A few years of bringing back the Ukrainian kind of language and culture under Lenin didn't fix things. Stalin trying to destroy the culture again, killing 10 million Ukrainians in the process, targeting Ukrainian musicians and clerics particularly, that did its damage. And so when you have someone like Khrushchev in the 50s claiming to be Ukrainian, sure, maybe his ancestors were Ukrainian, maybe he was from Ukraine, but a lot of that culture that he would have been raised in had already been effectively destroyed. And also there was no way of kind of, climbing the political ladder unless you talked like a Russian, looked like a Russian, celebrated like a Russian.
Did it come back once the wall fell and the Soviet Union disbanded? That was the moment that it could come out of the shadows and the language could be returned.
I mean, a lot of it existed underground. There were some parts of Ukraine where people strongly resisted this and suffered a great deal. Very many Ukrainian dissidents were from Western Ukraine, and a lot of the reasons that they spent time in Siberia was because they publicly spoke Ukrainian. There's also the role of the diaspora, which I'm part of. So my family's been here in the United States for 80 years now. There have been people who've been here in the United States and Canada for over 100 years. And so when Ukraine declared its independence in 1991, we were able to send books, send resources, send documents and records that would have been illegal to Ukraine. And for much of the 90s and early 2000s, people are like, this is nice, but it's very strange. Why would you do this? It's like, imagine someone showing up in Ireland speaking Irish or Gaelic. It's a very kind of antiquated language. Mm-hmm. So the language in Ukraine was still Russian after independence. But as Russia increasingly tried to invade and attack and destroy Ukraine, people are like, hey, wait a minute, what makes us unique are these cultural aspects. And these are the things that they're trying to destroy yet again. And so there's been a real renaissance in the last 3 years and in the last 10 years in Ukraine of people speaking Ukrainian, wanting to identify as Ukrainian, try to figure out what kind of lifestyles their grandparents had, and reestablish a very kind of traditional lifestyle, because they understand that that is what sets them apart, and that is what the Russians are particularly trying to destroy.
Well, I love this trip down memory lane. I'm a student of history, so this is very powerful and so useful. As we close out, if there's one thing that you didn't get a chance to tell our audience today, one thing you want to leave them with, what would it be as we close out?
Ukrainians want peace, and Ukrainians have fought for peace. And there's no moral ambiguity for standing up for what is right if somebody comes into your home, for you to ask them to please leave.
Well, important words to end on. Thank you all for joining us today for Peace and Power Ukraine. We continue to hope for a just peace in these coming days as we go forward. So thank you. See you next time.